Hi guys, welcome back to Barker's History, and today we're going to talk about part 2 in our unit on the pre-revolution. We're going to talk about what actually happens when push comes to shove, when Native Americans and French team up against the colonists and the British, and how this really does kind of lay the groundwork for future battles, and how it both gives the Americans confidence, but it also sends the British into large debt, which is going to have long-standing repercussions on both the colonies and the British Empire. And so your notes should have this written down as the French and as the pre-revolution part 2. This is again part of objective 1.2. So if you haven't finished 1.1 or if you haven't watched part 1 of this video, you do need to make sure you go back and do that. All right, so the French and Indian War between Britain and France, also better known as kind of the 7 Years' War, when it turned into a larger European conflict. And a lot of historians will sometimes say this is the First World War in essence, because if you were a British naval vessel out in the middle of the Indian Ocean and you encountered a French vessel during this war, you might engage each other and start attacking one another. Europe split really into two factions at this time. Countries that either sided with England and countries that sided with France. And war broke out across Europe as a result. Meanwhile, the British didn't have a strong army in America. In 1755, King George II sent General Edward Braddock to command the colonial forces. George Washington advised Braddock to fight Indian style, which basically meant like kind of, hand-to-hand combat, really guerrilla style. And that the European style of combat, his army's bright red coats, for instance, and method of lining up into columns, was put them at a distinct disadvantage. But Braddock ignored the advice. He was soon killed in a surprise attack. And the Redcoats, which was kind of the name given to British soldiers, again, because of their red, shiny coats, took huge losses. The British Secretary of State, who later went on to be Prime Minister, actually, by the name of William Pitt, he was really determined to drive the French out of the British territory. And so the fighting was costly, the debt he paid was high, but he sent more troops to try to win this battle, because he was not going to let his colonies be overrun by the French and Native American forces. With William Pitt involved, the tide does begin to turn. Those additional troops that he sent, the British Army and the colonial militia, they really begin to capture a lot of French forts. Fort Duquesne, for instance, became known as Fort Pitt, which would later become Pittsburgh. Quebec, the capital of New France, seemed impossible to attack, as a matter of fact, but the British successfully ambushed the city by cover of night. The Battle of Quebec was a turning point in the war. When Montreal fell, the next year, all of Canada suddenly became in British hands, and it actually would stay in their hands, and today, even still, it's a Commonwealth. That's why there is French Canada, there's the Montreal and Quebec areas of France that speak French, but the rest of Canada speaks English. And so the war comes to an end in 1763 when Britain and France sign what is known as the Treaty of Paris. Now, this can be confusing, so I made sure to put on here the Treaty of Paris 1763, because there's actually 3 treaties of Paris. There's the Treaty of Paris in the French and Indian War. There's a Treaty of Paris that ends the Spanish-American War, and then there's actually another Treaty of Paris later on down the line. So we'll talk about 3 different treaties of Paris in the course of American history. The treaty actually gave England all French territory east of the Mississippi, as well as Spanish territory of Florida. Spain had sided with France in the war, so they lost that. But actually, what's funny is the French got kind of the more lucrative end of the trade. They got the Caribbean islands, and those were where a lot more sugar plantations were. It was a large slave trade population there. And so they actually kind of did better in the long run. They were really more of the winners of all of this than the British. The British held on to mainland America, but lost in a lot more of the really more lucrative places to trade and make money. As you can imagine, if you had sided with the French, you were going to have to suffer the repercussions. And for Native Americans, life gets even worse. British expansion made it even harder to survive in the colonies if you were a native person. Trade with the British was less profitable, and more settlers were seizing land and establishing farms. An Ottawa chief named Pontiac tried to unite Native Americans against the British. In early 1763, his forces took the fort at Detroit and attacked forts and settlements along the frontier. Pontiac's Rebellion, or Pontiac's War as it came to be known, continued until he was killed in 1769, and the British defeated his allies. There is actually, in some cases, some of the first examples of what is known as biological warfare that happened during this time. Some accounts claim that the English invited Native American leaders to discuss peace during Pontiac's War, presenting them with gifts of blankets that had been intentionally contaminated with smallpox, causing a deadly outbreak of the disease. See, smallpox had been pretty rampant in the colony, or in the old world, in England and parts of Europe. And so many people had built up an immunity to it. But in the colonies, it had not, especially amongst Native Americans. They had never really been exposed to it. And so smallpox is incredibly deadly, and in some cases it completely wipes out entire tribes. So the French and Indian War has ended, Pontiac's Rebellion has ended, but we still have clashes between colonists and Native Americans. And to prevent more clashes from between the settlers and Native Americans from happening, King George III issued what was known as the Proclamation of 1763, making it illegal for settlers to live west of the Appalachian Mountains. This really angered a lot of the settlers, some of whom who had already purchased land that was now out of bounds, and so they didn't understand why they couldn't just live wherever they wanted to. And the proclamation was routinely disobeyed as a result. This really kind of set the stage for conflict between the colonists and the British, because before then, the colonies had really been left to themselves. The British had a policy known as salutary neglect, which means the colonists could kind of do whatever they wanted to as long as they were following basic British law. The king really stayed out of the way and let them kind of do, whatever. And this is one of the first times that the government's really telling the colonists, no, you have to follow this law, and we're creating this specifically for you because of you. All right, all of that brings us to question time. Why is this important, Mr. Barker? You're asking me right now. Well, if we're talking about the French and Indian War, it's incredibly important because the British took a lot of losses in this war. The British were the largest empire in the world at the time and seemed pretty invincible. But the war really showed that the British were not invincible after all, that they could be beaten. It also gave the colonists fighting experience, which they had not had before. It started to organize them. They started to learn military tactics and training measures and things like that. That's going to be very important when you want to develop your own military to fight against your former overseer in the British government. If we're talking about the Proclamation of 1763, well, that's really important because it's the first time the king really tried to inflict his will on the people of the colonies. And so both of these are very important for those two reasons. The colonists are now suddenly, losing a little autonomy. They're losing the ability to do what they want to, but they're also gaining the ability to have, knowledge on military tactics and fighting strategies and to understand that the British are not invincible. And so that's it. You've got everything you need now to move on to the next objective, 1.3, where we'll start to talk about what is the fallout of the French and Indian War. Britain is in debt, and they have to pay those debts off. They have to raise some money. And how do you raise money if you're a government? Well, you impose taxes. And that's going to be one of the biggest drivers of the American Revolution, is this frustration over a lack of representation in Parliament versus new laws being imposed on you that you don't really get a lot of say in if you're a colonist. For now, you need to make sure that you fill out your entire left side of your Cornell notes. Make sure you pull out any important dates and facts and information. Also, make sure you complete your summary at the bottom of the page. You can begin to kind of move on now to objective 2, or to level 2 of your page if you've done, because you've already got the Great Awakening done and you've got some of the pre-Revolutionary War stuff done. Make sure that you're still watching all of your videos, you're keeping caught up, and if you have any questions, please come see me. I am a huge resource for you. I'll be able to help you out. Until next time, have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.